Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Alexander Esser and I'm heading Aurora's business covering the Nordics and Baltics. Today I'm glad to welcome Jacob Stedman, CEO of Blykalla, to Energy Unplugged. Yeah, Jacob, great to have you here.
Thank you, Alexander. Great to be here.
I would like to talk to you today about the role of nuclear power for a future power system. If there is a nuclear renaissance, what government support is required for nuclear power, and especially also your technology and the market for your technology. But before doing that, I would like to welcome you. I would like to hear a bit more about yourself and Blykalla. So maybe the first question to you, for everyone who's not familiar with Blykalla, how would you describe your company in a nutshell?
I mean, it's quite simple. So we build small nuclear power plants. And to elaborate a bit further, I mean, typically talk about SMRs, small modular reactors. And that's the mission of Blykalla is to design and manufacture these SMRs and sell them to utilities and to industrial customers who need 50 megawatt or more of power. So we come back to the technology, but we believe we can build faster, cheaper, more sustainably, and also for more use cases than today's nuclear power.
Okay, interesting. And I mean, maybe just also this abbreviation SMR, we're probably going to use this much more. So small means around 50 megawatt, or is there a certain range? And modular means you can put them next to each other like batteries, like large-scale batteries?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the industry is quite, let's say, flexible with how it uses the terms. Many of these so-called SMRs are not small nor modular, but we believe we actually do something which is smaller in physical terms as well as in capacity. So we design something that's 5 meters times 5 meters and about 55 megawatt. So which is 3% of the power output of a large conventional nuclear power plant for the price of, 2% of a large-scale nuclear power plant.
Yeah.
But then in modular, I think modular is supposed to mean that you do things which is not based on very tailor-made and very customized supply chains, but instead you use, modular subsystems and systems that you can easily assemble and, replace. In practice, I think many SMRs are, basically just derived from conventional designs, slightly capped potentially, but some of the new players like ourselves that start more from more of a clean slate, we actually design more modular systems because we can.
Yeah.
And there are, of course, pros and cons of each. If you start from something complex and you try to simplify it slightly, it doesn't become modular. But of course, you have the advantage that there's a lot of proven technology that regulators and customers understand. If you start more from how do I want the future of nuclear to look like? Well, then you can design something that can actually scale and that's actually fit for purpose in a different way.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, well, that's great that we got the terminology right. So we're going to use SMR from now on. But before jumping into the technology and nuclear itself, maybe on two stories. I mean, first of all, I'd be interested in your own story. I know you are person of high demand at the moment. I saw photos from you with the Swedish energy minister and also with the Swedish crown prince. You recently signed several corporations. So what is your own story? How did you get into the energy space and to Blykalla?
I mean, the simplest way to summarize it. So I'm a computer nerd by background. I spent my teenage years coding, competed for Sweden in international coding competitions on the national team. And then I started my first software company when I was 16 and spent 5 years after high school developing software for e-commerce. So we sold nothing major, but we're 7-8 people at most, sold about 200 licenses to very small and medium enterprises that wanted to sell online. This was back in the late 90s. So, Amazon had started, I think, in 94. There were some Swedish vendors like NK selling, I think, going online around that time. And I started this in 96. So obviously, quite a new market, lots of explaining to do when you talk to these mail order guys who've been running their mail order business for 3 generations, and they've been using fax was the kind of the most high-tech thing they owned. So selling like shopping carts and all of that was a bit of a change to them. But obviously, eventually, all mail order today, I imagine, is e-commerce. So I did that. I spent 5 years doing that after high school. Then I cut my hair and got a degree. So I went to business school, ended up being a management consultant, spent 6 years with McKinsey, a consulting firm. And there I got into energy and electricity generation. So my main clients were all utilities, and I spent a lot of time thinking about the kind of strategic choice that you face as a utility. Should you pour billions into building new nuclear? Or should you pour billions into building hydropower or, different types of fossil assets and so on? So I got quite intrigued by this, giant projects where obviously energy is so important for everything in society. If we don't have energy, we're basically, hairless monkeys. So we need energy to make society work. But it also requires big commitments, makes us quite vulnerable, and affects society in different ways. So I got really intrigued by the sector. Then I left McKinsey, and after that, I mostly spent time running software companies again. So most recently, I was a CEO and a co-founder of Platform24, which is the largest telemedicine SaaS company in the Nordics. Basically makes it possible to interact with the healthcare system, talk to doctors and so on without leaving your home. Then about 2.5 years ago, after spending 7 years in health tech, I was quite intrigued by finding a way to come back into energy. And then I met the founders of Blykalla through an investor. And I realized that, wow, this is really a hidden gem, an unpolished gem, decades of innovation and research. Now there was a nuclear renaissance sort of lurking in the horizon. And I felt like, wow, it would be really cool to take this to market and build a product that, a utility can actually buy. Sure. So that's why. So I joined Blykalla as CEO about 2.5 years ago.
And so with your background in software development, where everything goes very fast and now changing to something that is so hardware-based like SMRs, I mean, is it very different for you to run a company like that?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, so I used to joke that, we do weekly, at Platform24, we did weekly releases every Thursday. Yeah. You get the new version out. Here at Blykalla, it's 5 years for the first release. So yes, of course, the timelines are very different. And I mean, telemedicine or health tech products are increasingly regulated, medical device regulation and all of that. But of course, nuclear power is yet another dimension of regulation. But I think leading engineering companies has many similarities. So, I mean, I'm used to leading engineers as in software engineers. Now it's more mechanical engineers, nuclear engineers, and so on. But I think I'm quite good at, connecting to what really matters, to people who do the work, and try to formulate something that people feel is inspiring and that they want to be part of. And of course, I mean, in software, I actually understand much more, under the hood, what actually happens. Physics, I have much more of a layman understanding. But I think being used to sort of working in this sector with this type of professionals and also with these sales cycles, I think is important. I think if you sold groceries for your adult life, I think switching to something that has multi-year sales cycles, I think is a bit, taxing. But to me, selling software to local regions is also multi-year in many ways. So yeah, there are quite a few similarities actually.
Similarities, yeah, I understand. Yeah, and I mean, you weren't there when Blykalla was founded, but I understand your CTO was one of the founders, right?
Exactly. Yep. So the 2 of the 3 founders are still around, but yeah, it was founded in 2013, and the company spent 9 years, very much in research focus.
Yeah. So what was the kind of the opportunity or the gap that they saw back then in the energy markets or in terms of technology that they identified and said, okay, that's worth starting a company here in this area? Like, what is the founding story behind it?
So I mean, I think it's a mix of demand and supply in a sense. So I think the real life story of Janne, one of our founders, is that he was a boy. He was 12 years old in 1980. And then Sweden had a referendum about should we, phase out nuclear or keep it. And Sweden voted then to phase it out by 2010. That didn't happen, obviously. But I think Janne, as a 12-year-old, was very touched by this. Why phase out something that works so well, that's so intriguing? Why can't you just fix the shortcomings or the challenges with nuclear? So he basically then, after that, dedicated his life to solving nuclear, which I think is quite cool. when he was older teenager, he participated in a national primetime television show, Belt, which is basically, like a big game competition. You get questions by the host, and if you answer all the questions, you win, I think, like 1 million kronor or something. He won. So he was basically everybody who had a TV who was alive in, 1980 something was watching him on like a few Saturdays in a row. So he's actually a bit of a local celebrity.
Yeah.
And I think that guided, all his academic choices late in life. And then, as you know, serendipity has it, he got exposed to the fact that lead-cooled reactor technologies, which is what we use, so we use the metal lead, liquid lead, as a coolant in our technology.
Yeah.
And he realized, after being exposed to, all other academic efforts, that this was a very promising method. And the background is actually, I think this is quite interesting. So the Soviet Union back in the 60s spent an enormous amount of money to make lead-cooled reactors work for their submarine fleet. Because for a submarine, you want something that's compact, that can run, without maintenance for a long time and so on. So they spent billions of dollars or whatever to make lead cooling work. Somebody told me they actually spent more on this than on the moon program.
Yeah.
They didn't get to the moon, maybe that's why, but this was a big focus for them. Then the Soviet Union fell apart in the early 90s. Janne was a young PhD, and then this was all declassified and basically shared with or sold to the West. And then Janne, as an ambitious young PhD, kind of picked this up like, here's a lot of knowledge coming out on the market. Maybe this is something I can, take further. So that's what he did, basically. And now, of course, Russia is a totally separate entity in the world. But I think that R&D from the 60s has very much guided a lot of later Western knowledge production.
Okay. And it's a very, very exciting story. And do you know if in Russia they also continue doing further research on this, which they started with originally?
They do. So they're actually building also a lead-cooled reactor, which is slated to go online next year, as I understand it.
Yeah. Okay. But maybe let's bring it a bit more on the European level. So, I mean, my perception is over the past 1 or 2 years, we have a bit of a nuclear renaissance, and governments, politicians really have ambitious new targets when it comes to nuclear. Maybe the exception is definitely also Germany. But so far, they haven't really walked the talk yet and rolled out the incentives or the markets or the structures to really get new investment decisions. So can you explain a little bit what is the current market for nuclear power and also the policy environment on a European level? How do you see it?
Yeah, so first thing is that, everything in nuclear is national. So the regulators that approve designs, but also financing schemes and all of that is national. So it's hard, I think, to summarize all of Europe. But if you look at some of the most relevant states, I think you see a lot of progress. Sweden, so where we are right now, is probably one of the leaders in the nuclear renaissance. The government has moved really strongly towards enabling new nuclear to be built. And I think it's fair to say it's one of their, highest priorities. I mean, obviously, defense these days, solving crime, all of that matters a lot also. But I think fixing energy, and in particular using new nuclear power, has been really high on the radar. So they've already, the first few months in office, they launched a number of public investigations, looking how does the licensing process look like, how does financing look like, what are fees, what are emergency planning zones, and so on. So I think they attacked almost everything that really matters to get new nuclear in place. I think Sweden is really a role model in that sense. And now we're also starting to see results. So already last year, some laws were passed that made it possible to build nuclear on new sites. That wasn't legal before. Now there is a proposition that will be, I think, voted on in Parliament pretty soon, which is about new financing. And then there will also be, later this year, there will be a new process for simplified licensing. So all in all, I think Sweden is really, moving from, ideas to action. I think also many other countries are making a lot of progress in Eastern Europe, Poland, Czech Republic, Bulgaria. The UK, of course, is a big nuclear country that's expanding even more and setting up, I think, a very structured approach to finding new technology for the next generation of reactors. So I think, this takes time, and I'm an impatient person, so I like weekly releases. But I think all in all, I think we're seeing a lot of traction in nuclear in Europe at the moment.
Okay, interesting, yeah. And you mentioned Sweden is leading also the way a bit in how to finance or how to push more nuclear into the system. Would you say, the current government plans that we have in Sweden by, first of all, making the permitting easier, providing some areas where you can build, and then having a contract for difference for nuclear, is that sufficient to actually see some investment decisions?
Yeah, I think you need a combination. As you say, licensing and financing obviously matters. And then there are other aspects of this. How do you handle waste, for example? I guess you can say that's part of licensing. But there are a number of parallel issues that need to be resolved. And I think all of them are on the government's radar. I think financing in particular, the combination of the three measures that you mentioned, like contract for difference, borrowing using the government's interest rate, and also a risk sharing, basically where the government compensates you if it turns out retroactively that your investment didn't reach the desired level. All these measures, I think, are, sort of best practice in Europe in a sense. They're based on UK experiences, they're based on Czech experiences. So I think they're quite well informed. Then, of course, you could say, they are, of course, tailor-made for including conventional large-scale nuclear. If you just had a support package for SMRs, that would probably be simpler and different. But I think it does a good job of, getting all sorts of nuclear built.
Yeah.
But I think waste is, if you're not from the industry, this sounds a bit technical, but it actually matters a lot. Nuclear waste lives for a long time. You want to ensure you have a future-oriented waste handling program. The current waste handling program in Sweden is very focused on the current fleet, both technically but also legally. So a new waste handling program needs to be put in place. So I think out of the outstanding issues, that's one of the biggest concerns, both for vendors, utilities, but also municipalities.
Yeah. So how to treat and manage the waste that comes out of any new build reactors.
Exactly. Yeah. And since, there's a certain sequence in this, you might say, but that's a problem for 2060 or 2090. Yeah. But of course, for a municipality to accept hosting a new reactor, they want a certainty that, in 50 years, this will be solved somehow. So you already today need to lay out many of these principles.
So would you say then it's more likely that actually any new reactors come at the same site or same municipality as the existing ones?
No, but I think the existing sites and municipalities, of course, have an advantage for all these reasons. Both the local, by definition, the local opinion is very popular. It's funny, you talk about the NIMBY, right? When it comes to energy production, people don't like to see wind power mills in the background or wind parks, but everybody likes living close to a nuclear power plant because that provides good jobs. So I think it's going to be much easier to start building on existing municipalities and existing sites. I think it will be new sites as well developed over the next 5 years, but that will take slightly more time.
Okay, yeah, interesting. And then you mentioned already that some of this new financing structure is a bit more focused on conventional nuclear. So would you say we will see first decisions on new conventional reactors in Sweden before we see SMRs, or could SMR even get in there earlier?
It depends on if you think about, starting to build or finishing building. So there is this fable around, is it a rabbit and a turtle? I don't remember all the details, but, you have these two animals racing. One is, super fast, but then it takes a long time to, it has certain obstacles. And then in the end, the turtle approaches. So I think even if you are slower to start with, let's say you have a new technology that needs to be regulated and assessed by the regulator, I think you can still get to the finish line faster potentially. But I think it's quite clear that Vattenfall, the big Swedish utility, will be the first one to prepare for building new nuclear. It's still open, I think, to everybody, whether they will choose a conventional design or an SMR design. They're looking at both.
Yeah.
But I think almost everybody else who's building in Sweden are looking at SMRs. So us, for example, and also other project developers are looking at SMRs, which, the claim is, of course, that they will be much faster to build since they're smaller and simpler.
Yeah. Maybe then it's actually a good time to actually look at the differences, because apart from size and production, I'm not completely aware yet of what the advantages are. So maybe I just list what are the 5 main criticisms of nuclear power, and you let me know which of those criticisms are actually addressed by SMRs.
Sure.
So the most typical criticisms of nuclear power are the safety concerns, number 1. Second one is the high capex, even though once they're up and running, the short-term marginal costs are low, but still the levelized cost of energy are deemed to be quite high. The third one is the construction time, which is deemed to be long. Fourth is what you mentioned already, the nuclear waste management and storage. And fifth, the inflexible baseload generation. So those are the main 5 issues with nuclear power. I mean, which one of those are being addressed by SMRs?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I think let's take them one by one. I think when it comes to safety, I think the general notion is that all nuclear is safe. And I don't think that which I think, I mean, if you look at all generating assets in the world, hydro, wind, solar, fossil fuels, you will see that nuclear power actually has the best safety record of them all. So fatalities per kilowatt, for example, is much lower for nuclear than anything else. You could say, well, it's fairly low for solar and for wind, but you do have workplace accidents. Actually, I mean, there are quite a few people killed in workplace accidents for solar and wind. You know, people falling off roofs or from the sort of falling down from wind park, the barrels. So nuclear has one recorded incident in the commercial history. And I think it's important to note, I mean, Fukushima, for example, was obviously a major economic event with billions and billions of destruction, but nobody died from radiation. So I think nuclear in general is safe, and I think that's true both for SMRs and conventional nuclear. Then you can say that certain designs, such as using lead as a coolant, means that you can achieve a high level of safety in a more cost-effective way. For example, you know, lead is a definition of radiation shielding. You go to the dentist, you get a lead apron to protect you from radiation. So that means that if you have lead as a coolant, you need less concrete for the containment. So, but overall, the end result, I think, for all nuclear power is similar. It's a very high safety.
Yeah.
So then when it comes to capex and construction time, for sure, I think that's one of the main ambitions for SMRs is to address capex and construction time. Both because, I mean, it's smaller because it's fewer kilowatt, but I think also it's less complexity. If you look at the big sites, you know, like Flamanville or Hinkley Point and all of these giga projects, you basically have 10,000 people milling around on the site for 10 years. And I think in general, it's really hard to build giga projects on time. It's not just for nuclear power plants. It's true for building bridges or tunnels or building harbors or airports or Olympic villages. I mean, all of these giga projects tend to have a lot of project risk. I can recommend a book on this. That's, I think, a really good read. It's called How Big Things Get Done. I'm not sure if you read it.
Yeah, I've heard about it, but never read it. But
I can really recommend it. So what they do is they look at all giga projects across these categories over the last, I think, 30 years. And then they say, okay, so out of all these giga projects with a budget of more than $1 billion, how many of them were built on time and on budget? Mm. What would you guess?
Just a fraction, probably 10%. I don't know.
I mean, it's a good guess. 8% says the book. 8%. If you also add the parameter, did they succeed in achieving the economic benefits that were, you know, predicted? It goes down to 1%. Yeah. So I think what I take from this is it's really hard to build big things, and that's why we, Blykalla and some other players, are not building big things. We're building small things. We think ourselves as more of, you know, the Vestas of nuclear power, or the Siemens Energy that does gas turbines, but for nuclear power. We build things which are 5 meters times 5 meters times 5 meters. They can be made in a factory, they can be shipped to the site, and they can be deployed. So we get rid of all this uncertainty related to the project execution.
And if you now, I understand you want to be cheaper, but I think the important metric to look at is always the levelized cost of energy. And I know for conventional nuclear is a huge range, and it also really depends on which sources you look at. But if you look, for example, at Lazar's annual figures, they are ranging between 130 to 200 euros per megawatt hour for conventional nuclear. I think that's in the US. So how would you see this improving when you're building SMRs instead? I think, well, if you double click on the LCE numbers, I think a very large share of that is capex, right? Yeah. And then you have a very big difference between the kind of like theoretical capex and the actual capex. So take, for example, Olkiluoto 3 in Finland. It was the capex was supposed to be 5 billion, and it ended up being 12 billion. Yeah. So of course, if you have a capex overrun of 7 billion euros on your reactor,
well, then your LCE is going to be pretty, touched by that overrun. So I think if you assume that all conventional nuclear power can be built according to the best ambitions, then I think you could get much below the 200 that you mentioned. Then you're probably talking about more like below 100. Mm-hmm. But if you have a more realistic view and realize that building these, especially first of a kind, these giga projects, you have a lot of uncertainty and most likely overruns, then you get closer to the 200 that you mentioned. And of course, a big bet for SMRs is that you avoid the project risk. And I can't mention a figure today, but we believe we will be significantly below 100 for our nth of a kind. So once we get into serial production.
Yeah. So basically, what you say is you're sticking to your promise more than for conventional nuclear.
Exactly.
Conventional nuclear, the theoretical LCE is much lower than the realized one, and you're reducing this gap or removing this gap.
Exactly. Yeah. So we think then of course SMRs itself is a wide SMR. I mean, people define it differently. We have what we talk about as true SMRs that actually are small and modular. So we think we could be much lower than many light water SMRs, for example, for both because it's less project risk, but also because we make some design decisions. For example, we don't need as much concrete because of lead's properties to absorb radiation. But then I think it's fair to say that, of course, conventional nuclear has advantages in terms of economies of scale. So if you magically, you can wave a magic wand and your nuclear power plant appears before you, I would probably want to have a conventional nuclear power plant because then you have, the FTE per kilowatt is lower if you operate a big plant, for example. But in the real world, you cannot wave a magic wand. You have, 2/3 of the cost of a nuclear power plant being financing, being the capex of actually building it. So that's what you want to optimize for. And that's where SMRs come from.
Yeah, okay, understand. Okay, and construction time and nuclear waste, inflexible baseload generation, those were the last three ones. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, exactly. I think the inflexible baseload is not so critical. I think so we can, for example, ramp up and down our design, at least down to like 50%. I think in practice, since there is quite a big capex component, you typically want to run your nuclear power plant as baseload, not as a regulating power. That said, you can do it. Either you ramp it up and down, or when the power market prices at hour are low, you use the steam for something else. Maybe you do make electricity and charge a battery instead of selling it on the grid, or you generate hydrogen, for example, or district heating and so on. So there are configurations where you can optimize for market hour by hour.
Yeah, and I would also see, that's also something we've done in some studies that, of course, nuclear will never be the peaking technology, but in a power system with more flexible demand, like, for example, the heat generation, steam generation, or also with more storage, then it actually doesn't matter so much that you don't go down to 0% of production, because the load can be shifted to those hours. Yeah.
No, but exactly. So then you can actually use it for as a regulating power to some extent. I agree, and I think that's an advantage of SMRs. I would agree. And then waste, it's similar issues. Especially consider that many SMRs use light water as a coolant, then you have very similar waste and waste challenges with waste. We actually, with our design, we want to, as a future option, we want to reprocess waste, meaning that the most active part of the waste can actually be put into a new reactor generation. And I think this makes nuclear much more sustainable. If you ask people, especially women, who are a little bit skeptical of nuclear, one of the main things that they say is typically that they don't want to, leave a burden for future generations. And that's what our technology enables, this reprocessing to happen. And this is not science fiction. This happens already today. France, for example, reprocesses quite a lot of its spent fuel. But this is really expensive, and France does it despite the costs. With our design, it actually becomes economically attractive to reprocess and reuse the fuel, because we have so much fissile material left in the fuel afterwards that you want to reprocess it. So we think, this is after the first generation of reactors, so this is in the future, but we think this will make nuclear much more sustainable.
Yeah. And maybe last one, construction time. And I know that the Swedish government is aiming at new reactors by 2035.
Yep.
I think that's now 10 years from now on. Is that something that's is realistic with SMRs?
Yeah, I mean, I think the government bets that this is realistic with conventional as well. I mean, if you ask the vendors for conventional power, they would say, yeah, we can do it in 7 years or something. History, I mean, doesn't fully, or let's say recent history doesn't fully support it. I think if you look at the program that Sweden ran in the 70s, we actually built 11 reactors in total, mostly according to time plan. So if you have a program, and I think that's what the government is saying as well, if you have a program and you don't just do one of a kind, you actually do like several that are identical, you can actually get to sort of more predictability in terms of time plan. But of course, with SMRs, you don't need to build, you don't need to spend 5 billion building one thing and then learning and then spending 5 billion building another. You get learnings after just a few hundred millions. So that's learning curves are much faster and cheaper with SMRs.
And they could work, run simultaneously and then reduce over time the construction time for each of them. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And you can also, with SMRs, you can also ramp up, right? I mean, if you look at Olkiluoto 3, the big conventional power plant in Finland, you have 20 years of waiting, and then you get 1.6 gigawatt online at the same time. And, prices drop in Northern Europe because this is such a major impact. With SMRs, you maybe get 50 megawatt online and then get another 50. So it's a much more subtle capacity expansion.
Okay.
But I think we have actually an ambition to, by the beginning of the 2030s, to get the new reactor up and running. So we at Blykalla have a more ambitious target than the government's 2035.
Okay, yeah, beginning of 2030, so that's a good number to have. Maybe then coming back to Blykalla, one question I had to you is how do you actually approach partnerships within the energy sector, also with other sectors? Because I also saw that you signed so many corporations recently.
Yeah, I say a lot internally that we are, a small fish in an ocean with many big fish, and since we are not, the legacy players, we need to have a lot of partners. If you look at how other players do it, some of them do like vertical integration. They want a pump, so they buy a pump company, or they spend a lot of money developing something in-house. We in general try to be focusing on what we do best, where we have unique global leading knowledge, and then we get partners for everything else. For example, for pump, we have a partnership with KSB, one of Europe's leading pump vendors that have experience of building pumps for lead cooling before. And then similar for other important components, we have other partnerships. We signed a partnership with ABB, for example, recently, the Swiss industrial giant, on instrumentation and control, power systems, cybersecurity, and so on, because they are best in class there. ABB actually also built the current Swedish fleet, or a big part of it, and then they sold that business unit later. But so they have a very strong heritage in nuclear. So we in general seek partners that are best at what they do, and then we do, where we stand out, which is the primary system and the reactor itself.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. And maybe looking a little bit ahead now, the next 1 or 2 years, what are specific milestones that you want to have achieved now in the next 1 or 2 years with Blykalla?
So, there are a few things. So we started building our test reactor at Uniper's nuclear power plant site in southern Sweden, Oskarshamn. So Uniper, which is one of the largest energy companies in Northern Europe, they are an investor in Blykalla, so a very important partner to us. And then they kind of let us use their nuclear power plant as host for our first test reactor. And this is a non-nuclear reactor, but we want to simulate and test as much as possible when it comes to sort of design decisions. So we broke ground for this just a month ago. And this would be the first part of the building is going to be built until May, June, and then we start tests by late summer. So this is an important milestone itself to conduct these tests. Another important thing is that we have 50 people, so we're 70 people in total today at Blykalla, and about 50 of them are engineers and project managers and so on, working on the design of the first reactor. So we want to freeze the conceptual design for the first reactor this year. And then we also want to submit what's called an application for a decision in principle for a first reactor in Sweden. And we think if we manage to do this, this will be one of the first in Europe where you actually have a new vendor for an advanced technology submitting a license application.
Okay, and once you're accepted with this license applications, then energy companies could potentially also procure your technology for building nuclear in Sweden.
Yeah, exactly. We believe we need a demo. This is a fairly conservative industry, right? Yeah. Nobody wants to, use unproven technology. Yeah. And the way to solve this catch-22 problem is really to show that we build a demonstrator, that we push the licensing, we push the financing. is not just going to be us financing it, but we're going to be part of it. And similar to, how a wind park is built, like an IPP. You set up a project, you ensure you get a good set of owners and other sources of funding in place, you get the license in place, and then it might be sold to somebody in the future. But that project development philosophy is how we think about these first few reactors. Then I think over time, we want to shift to be more of a OEM, a vendor that, similar to Siemens or ABB that sells technology to utilities and industrials.
Understood. Very exciting time ahead.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to monitor this and watch you succeed there. Maybe to just wrap up the session, we come to a section which we called overrated or underrated. Our audience will know that. So I don't want to miss out on an opportunity to ask you on a few concepts in the energy transition. And I'll ask you if you think they're overrated or underrated. Sure. And don't feel the pressure to elaborate on your responses. You can, of course. And the first concept is baseload power generation. Is this overrated or underrated?
Underrated. I think historically there's been a lot of push that you can do with just flexible or intermittent power. And so I would say it has been underrated, and now it's getting its rightful place in the energy space.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned already the second concept, so intermittent renewables, so wind and solar. Overrated or underrated?
Yeah, I have to say overrated then. I mean, I at McKinsey, I used to work with wind power, and I think wind is an important part of the mix. I mean, for one thing, it gives lower prices in certain hours of the day, which is great for consumers, right? Which are an important stakeholder on the energy market. But overall, I think it's overrated. And I think energy event, I think, is a bit of a tribute to that. You can spend billions, hundreds of billions, and still increase emissions, which is unfortunate, I guess.
Okay. Next concept, nuclear power powering the AI revolution.
I think that's underrated. I think it's not fully appreciated still how important that can be.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we've seen a lot of big news also coming from the US on that, or at least announcements.
Exactly.
And then last one, more European focused, the EU's Clean Industrial Deal.
To keep some balance, I guess I'll have to say overrated then. I mean, I have a softer position on this. I think EU policy sometimes, if you run a company, there's quite a bit of lag from something being announced in Brussels to it actually impacting your life. That said, I think I was actually in Brussels recently for an event related to this, and I think there is actually some traction. I think it sort of has the right ambition. Then let's see. I think the jury's still out how concrete this actually becomes. Okay. Yeah. Exciting. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming to the show. As I said, very interested about watching you succeeding and the progress in the next few months and years. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me here. Thank you, Alexander. Bye-bye.
That was Alexander Esser, who heads Aurora's business covering the Nordics and Baltics, talking to Jacob Stedman, CEO of Blykalla. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.